thank you for coming here. The work that I'm about to show is always difficult for me and problematic. Oh, good, there it is. Because, well, one, it deals with difficult subject matter. I deal with it in I think, a slightly more challenging way than a lot of other people have dealt with it. And it's sometimes controversial. It's caused grief with a number of my friends and support from numbers of others. I've been photographing the border, U.S.-New Mexico border, and this is really, the work I'm going to show today is pretty much one chapter. My primary focus has always been the rituals and community celebrations, but in 1989, I was asked by a colleague to do some work for an organization called Compañeros that was doing